really. I don't care. Okay, cool. We're on the internet, apparently. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to BSides Delaware. My name is Claire Tills, and today I'm going to be talking about advanced soft skills, how you guys can use efficacy to actually get things done in security. So a little bit about me, maybe. There we go. A little bit about me. I'm a communication researcher. My background is in public relations. Don't hold that against me. And I started studying cybersecurity when I was studying for my master's. I was researching crisis communication. And before I went to graduate school, I worked for a PR firm that focused on high-tech, mostly security. In that time, it was 2014. There were a lot of breaches going on, so we had a lot to talk about in our PR firm involving crisis communication and cybersecurity. And what I realized is people are doing this really badly. Cybersecurity communication as a whole isn't really a field. It's not a thing that exists in research in particular. And it's still brand new in terms of practice. I have a couple of friends who do cybersecurity communication, but there's maybe a couple of handfuls of us. So I started researching it. I started looking into crises. And from there, I've kind of expanded to be more broad communication about information security issues. Last April, or this April, I was in Rochester giving a presentation about crisis communication, and they had these lightning talks. And a couple of the lightning talks talked about how can we be more proactive in information security? How can we get people to actually take our recommendations and do stuff? And I was like, hey, I can help with that. So that's sort of how I put together this talk. It also came from a lot of the common complaints I heard from my friends in information security of, okay, no one listens to us. We have recommendations, we tell them to do things to be more secure, then they get breached and they come back to us and say, why didn't you stop this? So hopefully you can learn some things here today that will preempt that cycle of suck. And I also want to move InfoSec communication away from crisis communication. Most of what you see when people are talking about InfoSec is something is on fire, something has gone terribly wrong. That's not the best time to be talking about this. You want to be talking about it all the time. And here are some reasons. So when you only talk about something during crisis, you're creating the perception in people's minds that only crises happen here. So if you're only talking to people about information security when something scary and bad is happening, they're only going to have scary, bad associations with information security. They're not going to want to think about it. People don't like thinking about things that make them afraid. We don't plan properly for our wills or our end of life because we don't like talking about it. We are in denial that it will ever happen because it's scary. So by moving more proactive with communication about information security, we're building those better connections, we're building better mental associations, and trying to make people feel good about talking about information security, so then they'll feel good about doing something to be more secure. And also, only talking about information security during a crisis creates silos in an organization. Your PR team, if you're in a firm, is probably never talking to your security team. They're completely siloed. And then during a crisis, that's the only time they're getting in touch. And so they see it as, okay, well, I only need to talk to my security team when something goes wrong. No, you want them talking all of the time. So, and then what if the bad thing never happens? So this is something that I've heard about a little bit where, you know, there's a lot of Chicken Little potential for some information security. We keep saying, if you don't do this, something bad will happen. If you don't do this, something bad will happen. But we've seen so many organizations fall victim to these huge mega breaches that should totally end their company. But we haven't seen any companies actually go out of business because of these mega breaches. That might change, it might not. So what if the bad thing never happens? If you keep telling people something bad's going to happen and it never does, they stop listening to you. So being more proactive is just a better way to get people to listen to you and to act. So that's why I am here, hopefully, to help you. So I call this advanced soft skills because it takes a step beyond just learning how to talk to people, building relationships. It's the direct application of empathy. If you read any piece on how to use soft skills or improving soft skills for information security, there are a lot of them out there. They're all fantastic. Most of them are going to mention empathy. And so empathy is the idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, and you really need to do that in order to apply efficacy. You need to envision a lot about the other person in order to use it. So that's why it's called advanced soft skills. Just a quick little bit on that. So why should you guys care? Have you ever had an I told you so moment at work where you gave a recommendation and it was totally ignored and then something bad happened? Couple of nods, hand up, thank you. Did it feel good to say I told you so in that instance? No, it doesn't feel good. Sometimes it feels really good to say I told you so. Sometimes it feels awful. So hopefully you can apply some of these skills and tactics to avoid the I told you so moment and just tell them and then they do the thing. So the premise here is that there's some risk or threat that requires action to mitigate it. And you're going to use efficacy to convince them to do some behavior. You need to know what behavior they need to do to fix the problem, and efficacy is how you're going to get them to do it. So I've used this word a lot already. Efficacy. Anybody familiar with the term? You heard it before? A couple of nods. I think you were at my talk already, so you don't count. He read ahead. So efficacy is the power or ability to produce an effect. It's effectiveness. I use it because it comes from scholarship. It's one of those words that they've decided to stick their hat on, and so I'm going to stick my hat on there as well. So where does it come from? It's got a medical background. I'm not going to say nope, yeah. I did it in DC, and I shouldn't have tried to do it again. So in the medical field, it is defined as the capacity for beneficial change. So what's the therapeutic effect of a drug, device, or procedure? So if something will cure a disease, it has high medical efficacy. I think it might, I've seen it a couple of times used in terms of technology. You know, the technology has some sort of efficacy to solve a problem. This concept eventually traveled across campus to the social sciences through health communication, so that makes sense. The doctors were using it in their research. Then the people who needed to talk about the doctor's research used it in their communication, and that's sort of how it transitioned across campus. So what are some issues you think health communication is using efficacy for? Any ideas? Just shout it out. Yeah, so medical advertising might use efficacy. You'll see it in campaigns. So if you think of public health campaigns, so your public health authority wants you to do something. They want you to get a flu shot. They want you to use condoms. They want you to avoid smoking. All of those sort of pro-health communications you see, those public service announcements, those are using efficacy. So this is looking at how doctors and public health organizations convince people to do healthy things. The one example that I want to show is a commercial that ran several years ago. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with it, but I've got a video at the end. And I really like this because it's a good example of efficacy. It's a commercial that's trying to tell you how to determine if you have prediabetes and then get you to talk to your doctor about it. And so the way it works is this man in a lab coat comes up and has you answer a bunch of questions. And with each question, you put up a set of fingers. So if someone in your family already has diabetes, put up one finger. If your body shape looks like this and he has a chart, put up the associated number of fingers. And then at the end, he says, okay, if you have more than 7 fingers up right now, you should talk to your doctor. And this is a really good example of how efficacy works because it's about reducing the barrier to action and making things seem simple and meeting the audience where they are. So we're going to look into these tactics a little more, but I want to cover one last area where efficacy comes into play, and that's emergency preparedness. And so that's sort of where I see information security coming into play as well, as emergency preparedness is about doing things to prevent damage when something bad happens. So do you live in an area that is subject to a lot of hurricanes or flooding? Here's how you prepare your house. Preparedness, I think, overlaps really well with information security. So that's why I wanted to throw this in. All right, so principles of usage. So we're finally going to get into what we're actually doing here. I'm going to stop kind of parsing it among different disciplines and just talk about it generally. So we're not going to say this is from HealthComm or whatever. This is just a kind of grab bag of all different ideas from efficacy. So there are a couple of types of efficacy, and I'm going to talk about two: self-efficacy and response efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that you can actually perform the recommended action. So whatever you're being told to do, if you don't think you can actually do that, you have low self-efficacy. And then response efficacy is, will this thing actually solve my problem? So if someone tells you to do something to solve your problem and you don't think it's going to work, you have low response efficacy. So in order to actually use this, you need to know a little bit about your audience. And this is where empathy comes in, because in a lot of cases you won't be able to ask your audience this. But you need to know whether or not they actually recognize there's a problem. And that's something that I think we struggle with in information security. A lot of our audiences either don't know there's a problem, don't know how serious the problem is, or don't think the problem is theirs. So you have to kind of argue with them and convince them, this is your problem, you own it, you have to do something, not just you can do something. And then constraint recognition. What are some things that your audience sees as barriers? So what are some barriers that people might throw at you when you tell them to do something about InfoSec? Budget, yes, our favorite one. What else though? Time, budget, time. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that one. History. Yeah, we don't do it that way, or we've always done it this way, or we've never been breached before, so we're totally fine, right? Those are all barriers. And so what you do with efficacy is think about, okay, why do they see that as a barrier, and how can I get them around it, over it, through it, or show them that it doesn't actually exist? So what you want to know is, where are they now? What barriers do they perceive? Do they see an actual problem in existence? And where do they need to be to act? What is that sort of minimum level of interest or constraints or what have you that will actually get them to do something? And that's something that we're going to need a little more empirical research on. I hope to do that eventually, but you get the idea that, you know, you have to move them somewhere. You don't have to get them to being InfoSec evangelists. You just have to get them far enough along the ticker to actually take the action you want. So now you know where they are, and now you know where they need to be. So how do you get them from point A to B? What we've been using a lot in InfoSec has been fear. And I've mentioned before, that hasn't worked super well. And I think a lot of that stems from the sort of history of how InfoSec has been treated as a field and a discipline. It's been treated like dark sorcery and hidden in a corner, and no one really wants to talk about it. So the information security people had to be louder. They had to shout to get attention. And now people are actually paying attention, but InfoSec is still kind of in that place where we think we need to be loud and shouty and scary to be heard, because that's how it has been. But I think we can move in a more positive direction, focus less on fear, because people are listening. And if you move in a more positive direction, people will feel better talking to you. If they feel better talking to you, they'll want to do it more, and you'll build those relationships. So I haven't said this yet, but we're talking a little bit about manipulation. You're trying to manipulate their perceptions. You're trying to persuade and influence them. And PR and communication likes to avoid the terms manipulation, but that is what you're doing. The thing here, though, is you're supposed to be using this for making people more secure. you're trying to kind of hack their risk perception, show them that they are at risk, they can do something about it, and make them more secure using efficacy. So I can trust you guys to use these powers for good, right? Promise? Right, exactly. That's totally the audience that I should be asking to use this power for good. Anyway, this is how you actually do it. So self-efficacy, you can do something and you have to do something. So first they have to realize there's a problem that requires action. I mentioned that. And you have to remove perceived constraints. So this is where you think about what are their constraints. Unfamiliar behavior, trust, money, those are all constraints that I think really apply to information security. Unfamiliar behavior, these people have probably never done the things you're asking them to do. They have no idea what two-factor authentication is. They don't know any of the controls you're talking about. You guys don't necessarily speak the same language. That creates a lot of anxiety in people and makes them uncomfortable. And that's a constraint. They stop listening when they feel bad. So trying to take a step back, reduce the language, reduce the things you're asking them to do into very small, understandable steps is important. And that really does depend on your audience. If you're talking to executives, they're going to have a different level of understanding than if you're talking to a CISO or if you're talking to your mom at home. So find out what language your audience is familiar with and stick to that. So they don't have to ask you to define words. You're doing it beforehand. You're preempting their questions and anticipating their needs so that you show that you're empathetic and you're listening and you're caring. So now that you have convince them that the constraints are gone. Actually, I want to go back. So what are some other ways that you might reduce constraints for your audience? So say that the constraint is trust. They don't trust security procedures. They don't necessarily trust you because you're a brand new face. What might you do to build trust? Or a different constraint if you want to pick that. Become their friends. So show that you know stuff about them. And we'll get into this with response efficacy as well. But if you're consulting with an organization and they say, okay, well, that's not going to work for us, your response should be, okay, well, based on this, this, and this in your organization, I know that this will work. So showing that you've done your research and you know them and you've taken the time to tailor your responses to them as an individual, they will feel special and they will trust you more. What about unfamiliar behavior? I gave a couple of general ideas, but what are some other ways you can reduce that constraint? Training. So start early. If you're trying to do employee awareness, it should be an ongoing process. It shouldn't be one and done. Ongoing exposure to these sorts of this terminology, these sorts of behaviors is the way to make people more comfortable. That gets rid of unfamiliar because they're seeing it all the time. It is now familiar. All right, so now response efficacy. So you want to prove that this is the best action for them. Why are you telling them to do this particular thing? There are a lot of different solutions in information security. The thing that I always point out in this for sort of my friends and people who aren't as technical is I ask them, okay, how do you make a good password? What is a good password? And they can't answer because to them, there's no solid agreement on what a good password is. That's the perception we're dealing with, is that we don't have our ducks in a row. We can't agree what the best response is, so why should I trust what you're telling me to do now? That's the thing you're trying to get across. You're trying to say, no, this is the right response for you, here's why. So again, you're going to be tailoring it to their specific case, saying, I know this much about your organization, and that's why. I know that this is the right thing because of X, Y, Z. If you have statistics, that's fantastic. Anecdotes are also really good. Tell people a story to get them to change their behavior if you have it. Make one up. Tell a hypothetical story and use that to get them through and show that this is the best action. So I want to circle back to fear one last time and talk about why we don't respond to those. So if someone says to you, you have 20% risk of this thing happening, you're probably going to think you're part of the 80%. If they say there's a 99% chance of this happening to you. You're going to think you're part of the 1% that it won't happen to. It's just human nature to think that we are special. That's not a bad thing. That's just how everyone works. You're going to think you're part of the percentage that is safe. You're going to come up with lists of reasons why you are not at risk. And so that comes in with response efficacy. You're trying to convince your audience, unfortunately, you are not special. You are going to be at risk for this. You are probably part of that 20% or 50% or 80% that is susceptible, and here's why. So walking them through your rationale is really important. It's like in school when you were told to show your work and you were like, I got the right answer. Why does it matter? Here it does matter because you're trying to lead your audience through your decision process so that they can see, okay, well, I would have made a different decision here, so I can negate everything else they say. If you're walking them through your decision process and you're convincing, they're following you and they will come to the same conclusion. It's almost about tricking them into thinking they made the decision themselves. So show your work. Yeah. I'm really glad you asked that question because I'm currently working on updating this talk based on research I've been doing right now into gain-loss framing, and that's exactly what I'm arguing is that you should focus on the positive. So you should focus on gaining instead of avoiding to move even farther away from fear. So instead of saying you have a 20% chance of being a victim, say this solution will improve your security. Like, focus on being more positive. Focus on the benefits that they're going to gain. And so that's something that I've been working on, and I'll kind of plug my blog later so you can look at it. But that's a really good question. Moving away from saying, here are your risks, here's how dangerous this is for you, try focusing on, here's how good you'll feel after you do this thing. You'll be able to step up and pass your competitors. You'll be able to brag to your friends. Or, you know, when I tell my friends and family to start doing different security things, I'll say, okay, well, I'm going to teach you, and then you go to work and teach your friends, and they're going to think you're really smart. They're going to think you're really smart and cool, and you're going to be a badass in your office. And so focusing on the positive side of things is sort of the next step of this. So thank you for that question. Perfect. It's like I planted that, but I didn't. So, no. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, no, and so that brings it to a good point as well, is knowing your audience, is knowing where your audience is and what will persuade them. The story I tell a lot in when I taught public speaking and we were preparing for persuasive speeches is whenever I was trying to convince my dad of something, he is an engineer, so he needs to know the math and the science and whatever sort of hard facts behind your decision. So whenever I was trying to persuade him, I would do calculations. I would come up with, at one point I actually used net profit in a conversation with my father to convince him. Whereas with my mom, she is not as hard science. She wants just to focus on the more qualitative benefits. So I'll say, it'll make me really happy if this thing happens. And so knowing your audience and what will persuade them is the foundation to all of persuasion, is knowing what is actually going to be persuasive to these people. So if you're talking to money people, you're talking about return on investment. So you need to figure out how to calculate the actual return on investment because they need to hear dollar amounts. And so that is a really key point as well, is You do want to be more positive, but some people you will have to scare. And you are going to have to make that decision on your own, or hopefully, you know, talk to the communication people, because their whole sort of background, we've spent years in PR trying to figure out how to quantify what we do, because what we do isn't easy to quantify. It's seen as fluffy, it's seen as a waste in a lot of organizations. That's taken a turn now, but we do have a history of trying to figure out how to show hard statistics and ROI for something that is avoiding bad. So you can't quantify, okay, well, because you applied this, you didn't experience a breach, and here's the money you didn't lose. Like, that's not the best way. So figuring out how to quantify this is something that communication and PR can also help with. And there are other fields who've done it as well. But yeah, it's all about picking your audience, knowing what they need to change their behavior. So
I think balance, as much as positive, at the time we spend so much.
Exactly. And I think the balance is the key part, is not only focusing on one or the other. I think the way that I would recommend is developing a narrative through what you're saying. So start off scary. So start off with these statistics, start off with their actual risk and the difficult potential and all of that. And as you're progressing, move in a more positive direction. That's another principle of persuasion. You start off with negative emotions, and as you're communicating, you're transitioning into more positive. You're talking about the benefits they'll gain in addition to the risks that they're going to avoid. So really taking that balance and creating a narrative with it. So you're telling them a story, and they're the heroes of that story. So I'm going to skip the exercise for now and talk a little bit about some of these specifics for InfoSec. I've hit them a little bit, but I want to kind of circle back. So before an incident, you got to make the risks real. So show them similar organizations to them. Show how those organizations are similar. So if you're trying to use Equifax as a case, why is your company similar to Equifax? What are the similar cases? Are they in a similar field? Are they going to be targeted because of the data that they have? So really tying together your scary statistics with why it applies to them, getting them over that hump of it'll never happen to me because I am special. Why are they not special? Linking security behaviors to ones that they already do. This is one that I think is especially particular if you're talking to end users. If you're talking to an end user, they're not going to be familiar with the language, they're not going to be familiar with the behaviors. If you're able to link the security behavior to something that they're doing in their life already, so maybe using or doing a drill. So I hear likening it to fire drills all of the time. It's not a bad idea if you're talking about having them do security audits or penetration testing. Maybe liken that to quarterly performance reviews, things that they're doing on a regular basis. So that's going to be a little bit on you to think about, okay, I've got this security thing that I want them to do. What is that like in their everyday life? So think about it. Use that empathy, that sort of putting yourself in their shoes. Even just think about what you do in your everyday life that's similar. And then overcoming fatalism. This is one that we see a lot in information security as well. It's not if you get breached, it's when. Companies are starting to get wise to that. And they're like, okay, if I'm going to get breached anyway, why bother? Why even do this? And so trying to get them over that, I think the positivity might help. Showing the different benefits. You're not just going to avoid a breach. You're going to be a leader in your field. You're going to step ahead of your competitors. Whatever other benefits that they can get beyond just avoiding a breach, because there's a good chance it's still going to happen. All right, so during an incident, you can still use efficacy. You can still use these communication principles. You're highlighting the protective powers of whatever behavior you're doing. So instead of avoiding risks, you're telling them doing this thing will protect you. So when people are talking about doing credit freezes after Equifax, this is how it's going to protect you, that sort of example. So instead of saying it'll avoid a breach, saying how it's going to defend you once a breach has happened. Using statistics and anecdotes to prove Your response efficacy is also important here. And then finally, you want to break it all down into small digestible actions. So you guys probably do this already in terms of not just plopping a whole security plan in front of your person of contact or anyone. You're going to take it into little bites. So we do this first, and it's really easy, and it's like doing this in your everyday life, and then you do this, and making it small and digestible so they're not overwhelmed. All right, and then embracing uncertainty. There is a lot of uncertainty in information security, and you're better off actually fessing up to this uncertainty in your conversations with people than trying to deny it. If there is uncertainty, if you can't make guarantees, don't do it. Say, okay, well, this is your best case scenario because I'm an expert. I know what I'm talking about. Here's why I think this is the best case scenario. If you try and tell them that this will save them and it doesn't, you're breaking down trust. You're trying to build trust and actually coming forward to someone and saying, this is your best case scenario, this is the best I can do, it's not 100%, but it will be better, can help build trust, because people are initially reactive when they hear overpromising or think that people are overcompensating for potential drawbacks. So if you come forward and point out the drawbacks proactively, you're going to build that trust. They're going to say, okay, they're not hiding things from me. They're pointing out that drawback. They're not hiding anything else. They're going to tell me straight up. So a way to build trust with that. All right, so times of crisis, I want to skip this a little bit. And so today we've talked about moving information security communication beyond crisis. We're saying how fear isn't the best motivator. You definitely want to have risk statistics, but you also want to balance that out with more positive messaging. Simple explanations like my end users are stupid or they don't care aren't sufficient because they don't actually get anything done. And yes, a lot of end users make mistakes and do the wrong thing. A lot of executives don't listen to you when they should, and it's horribly frustrating. I can't even imagine. But stopping there doesn't solve the problem of people being insecure. Using efficacy and understanding, okay, why don't they care enough? Why aren't they paying attention to their risks? Thinking about the whys behind these simple explanations can help you get around them, hopefully. And then finally, efficacy is direct application of that empathy to try and get across. So what we still need to know here, through empirical studies, I want to find out what are people's levels of efficacy. Do they think they actually have the capability of being more secure? And that's all audience-based. Do executives think this? I've seen a lot of studies recently of, usually the statistic is executives think that they are prepared to respond to an incident despite the fact that in the last year 65% of them failed to do so. So that's where you see it, is they think they are capable of doing things when the statistics show that they are not. But I want to get some more statistics on that. And then levels of problem recognition. Do people actually think that these problems are theirs and that they need to be solved? So this is a little bit more about end users, the general public. How concerned are they really with their security? And do they think it's a problem that they need to solve? Constraints, we talked about that a little, but also thinking more about the psychology behind it. So why do people ignore security recommendations on a psychological basis? Why are they giving the excuse of money? Is it because money is really a case? Because when you really think about it, an investment in security shouldn't be that big of a deal. It should be important enough to get over most budgetary constraints. So what's the psychology behind them saying, we don't have the money for it? It might be legitimately, we don't have the money, but there might be something else. It might be, we don't see value in security. So how do you twist that? How do you get them to actually see value? And then finally, what's the threshold for action? What movement do you need in their constraint and problem recognition, in their self-efficacy, in their response efficacy? How far do you need to get them to move? Because if you only need to get them to move a little bit, that's really different than if you need them to move a marathon. So figuring out how much distance is required how much persuasion is required is really important. And then figuring out, and this is more of a project for me, is figuring out increased consensus on recommendations. Everyone's going to have their own solutions, but trying to figure out how to communicate what the best practices really are. So that's what I have to cover. Some further reading here. Where to find me? I am on Twitter all of the time. I have a blog that I write about every other week, and so you'll see that updated post on gain and loss framing. And so with that, I argue about moving in that more positive direction, focusing on the benefits that your audience can gain from being more secure and how to develop a communication program around that. So that's my information. I also include some scholarly sources. I really recommend you look them up if you're interested. You can read just the abstract if you want, because they're probably about 20 pages each if you're not a nerd like me. So let's go back to the overview, and I'll take some questions. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so I kind of see two answers to your question. And so the question was about sort of the I'm doing this for the web folks and the people in the other room. The question is there a place for the stereotypical antisocial InfoSec person in this sort of model? And to that one, the answer is definitely yes. I see this as it's kind of a formula. So if you don't do well with people, I'm an introvert despite all of this. I'm uncomfortable talking to people I don't know. And so having a formula like this, okay, I can brainstorm and think about their constraints. What are their constraints? How do I break down those constraints and get them around it? It can give you a little bit more of a script and a formula to be more comfortable and more personable if that's not your jam. So you can kind of script out what you're going to say more, so you're not necessarily talking off of the cuff, and be more prepared. So you don't have to necessarily be charismatic or extroverted. You can plan ahead, have a script, have an outline, have brainstorm questions, and treat it a little more like an engineering or math problem rather than something softer. And so that's part one. And part two is if you are an InfoSec person who is more personable, who doesn't fall into that stereotype, you can then kind of step forward on your team and say, I got this. Like, I will be the external face of our team. I will use these skills. So sort of double answer to that of if you're the stereotypical person, you can take this a little bit of a step back, make it a little less fluffy, and make it more about a math or science problem of, okay, I have this constraint, and here are the ways that they can get around it, and make it a little more flowcharty and less storytelling. But if you do like storytelling, if you like talking to people and you're in InfoSec, this can be a really good way to kind of flex those skills and get that into your wheelhouse a little bit more. Did I answer your question? Okay, great. Yes. Yes. Yeah, that would be my dream for security teams and communication teams inside of an organization working together to develop communication. And we see that in a couple of organizations. Maybe a handful of organizations are actually teaming up communication and security to develop communication programs and messaging and campaigns and all of that. So it is happening. And if you have relationships with your communication team, you can go to them and say, hey, I need to do this presentation to get more budget. Can you help me out? They'll probably have the tools to help you out. They might have just general speaker training guides. They might have actual like budgetary presentations that they've given that worked. So make friends with your communication people, and I don't just say that because I'm a communication person and I like having InfoSec friends, but take them out to coffee, meet them at just an all-hands meeting, get to know them, because hopefully what I want to see is organizations talking openly about security when shit isn't on fire. So eventually, my idea is that the security team is going to be working with communication, because they're going to be talking about communication, or they're going to be talking about security all the time. So they're going to need that relationship. But that's just pie in the sky dream for me. Any other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. No, that's a really good question. So the question is, how do you get someone to change when you're telling them that they're wrong and making them feel bad about being wrong? And that's a big question. And I think a lot of it has to do with giving them an excuse for being wrong, letting it be okay that they've been wrong. And maybe it isn't actually okay. Maybe you went to them 2 years ago when the problem actually started, and they didn't listen to you then, and you had to come back now and say, hey, look, I was right, you were wrong. That's not the approach you want to take. So giving them an excuse to be wrong, making it safe. So potentially you're showing them brand new technology or a new problem, trying to find a way to make it okay that they were wrong and kind of protect themselves, save face in their wrongness. Or, depending on which direction you're going, try and just present them like, hey, I've got this problem. How do you think we should solve it? So let them come up with the solutions, start that conversation of just, here's a problem that needs a solution. Don't attribute it to anyone. Just say, here's a problem that exists. Can we work together to fix it? So they don't have to be wrong. They're fixing a problem. Or, giving them that safety of like, you were wrong, but here are all of the reasons that it's okay you were wrong. So many other people were wrong. Or here's a brand new technology that proved that you were wrong and you didn't know. All of those things. Great. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good plug, so I'm going to repeat it for the internet. Public speaking isn't easy for the majority of people. I was and sort of am still technically a professional public speaker, and I couldn't have coffee this morning because I was going to just like vibrate at a frequency that made me invisible. I was so stressed out. And like, I'm fine now. I've given this talk before. I'm very comfortable with it, but I still have anxiety when I speak publicly. He mentioned a couple of people. WebReacher gave a really great talk at BSides DC that's online that you can see about imposter syndrome, and I think that extends here as well. But getting experience with public speaking or just speaking to small groups, I think is really important for anyone, and particularly if you're naturally introverted. The way that I kind of solved this problem was when I joined grad school, I had to teach. I taught 3 50-minute sections 3 days a week. That's a lot of public speaking in front of freshmen in a required public speaking course. So it wasn't a really excited audience. So I don't recommend doing that for anyone, but finding something like Nova Hackers or a different local small organization that does these sorts of things, if there's something like Toastmasters or anything like that that you can be a part of. There's a program called Nerd Night as well that's not InfoSec. You can talk about security issues, but anything where you're getting up, practicing, and talking to people is a really good sort of practice to get into. Pushing yourself out of that comfort zone will really add these skills kind of to your tool belt. And when you're just a decent public speaker, no one really notices. They're like, oh, he was good, he was good. They don't, they don't notice your mistakes. They don't really point anything out. You're fine. But when you're a good public speaker, when you really hit your mark, people remember and they notice and they remember you. So that's one way to get these across as well, is to be memorable. So practicing your public speaking, I think, is a great plug as well. Any other questions? Yes. 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 Yeah, so becoming friends, I think with legal in particular, is great, because when organizations are making decisions about security, they're thinking, is this going to get us sued? So they're going to talk to their legal team. So if their legal team then can say, oh wait, no, I know the person you should be talking to about this, and that person is you, that's great. So even maybe before you talk to your communication people, which breaks my heart, talk to your legal team. Make friends with the legal team. Make friends with the people who write the budget. Understand why they write the budget in a particular way and try and slide in that direction. All right, any other questions? All right, so I'm going to wrap up now with that. Thank you guys so much for your attention. I'll be around the rest of the weekend if you want to keep talking. Thank you.